Can you cite anyone that thinks our genome's improving?
No, 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 no,
Can you cite anyone that thinks our genome's improving?
no, 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 no.
And welcome to the Evidence and Reasons for the Christian Faith video channel. I'm Salvador Cordova. Glory and honor to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. In this segment, I'll talk about the moment that Dr. Dan lost the genetic entropy and the evolution debate. Fundamentally, this is about evidence. It's not about what I say or what other people say, including my distinguished boss, Dr. John C. Sanford, my colleague and mentor. And it's what the evidence says. That debate happened 6 years ago, and in the intervening years, the genetic evidence has been piling up in favor of my claims and against Dr. Dan's claims. And this has been driven by the simple fact that the cost of examining DNA, what we call DNA sequencing, has dropped by a factor of 1 million to 1 billion times in the last 40 years. That means for $1,000 today, we can examine and actually know DNA that would have cost us a billion to a trillion times the price 40 years ago. That means that evolutionary biologists can no longer just get away as easily as they have been with just passing off their speculations as facts, as if they're experimental facts. We actually now have facts in hand. And as in that clip, and I'll explain how I edited it, Dr. Dan was forced to admit, even 6 years ago, that he can't name one geneticist of any reputation that thinks the human genome is improving. Now, evolutionary biology has been often described as change over time. That is, like in a species line, like say the human species, over generations, evolution of the human species is how they've changed over time, over the generations. So let's just use that as a working definition for now, that evolution is change over time. And that means if the human genome is always changing, if it's not improving, it must be changing for the worse. That is simple logic. And I caught him. I caught him in that moment. Now, back then I was naive about how debates go, and I thought people would be better good faith actors in debate rather than kind of like sketchy lawyer tactics, where when I finally make a credible point that is extremely significant, it gets dismissed and the discussion is then misdirected to irrelevancies. And I let it go back then, but I'm not letting it go now. This is a bad faith action where trivialities and irrelevancies that are away from the central point are emphasized. Why would someone do that? It's like if they're losing the case on the facts and the central points, they have to go to they have to distract the issue and at least score a draw. And that's what happened in that debate. But I have preserved this in the archives. You can look at Modern Day Debate, Genetic Entropy, Part 2, where Dr. Dan had to admit this. And recently, like over the last year or so, I confronted him. I said, well, nothing's changed. He's never been able to say he could find one geneticist that thinks the human genome is improving. And this time around on Reddit, rather than admitting that he had no answer, he said, well, it depends on your definition of what improvement is. And at that point, I knew I had really won the case, because it's not very difficult to see how fitness is defined in the medical profession. So if your kid is sick, if your offspring, your children are having birth defects, they are sicker. It's not that hard. If they're not as healthy in a variety of dimensions, it's not that hard to say whether the kid's health is improving over time in his own health or even cross-generationally? Is he as healthy as his parents? And so rather than address the issue, Dr. Dan demands from me a definition of fitness. And I said, yeah, Dr. Dan, I know your game. Why don't you provide a definition of fitness and see if you can answer the question I posed? Now that puts him in a dilemma. If he concocts his own definition of fitness that is not consistent with what's understood in the medical profession, he can get called on it and say that's a ridiculous definition, which, by the way, is the evolutionary definition. That's why you have books like the New York Times bestseller Survival of the Sickest, where sickness is actually viewed as increasing evolutionary fitness. This is crazy. In evolutionary biology, sickle cell anemia is considered a fit trait, what they call the heterozygous expression of it anyway. This is nonsense. But they are so desperate to indicate that they find evidence of actual improvement that they have to make up stuff and distort the definition. And I knew that. And so he knew I would call him on that and say, look, your definition's just garbage. You've inherited it from your evolutionary community, and it's garbage because they have nothing to cling to, that they have to actually twist things. Because if we actually examine the physical evidence now in the era of cheap genome, cheap DNA sequencing, where we can actually tell if the human genome and other genomes are deteriorating in terms of the functional capacity, it's evident that evolutionary theory is not holding water, especially Darwinian evolution. And it's worse than that on some levels. For example, Darwin claims survival of the fittest. Well, if your definition of fittest is the most reproductively efficient, rather than kind of the medical and common sense notion of what real fitness is, such as health markers, you get some peculiar conclusions. So it is known, and it is concerning, that IQ is declining. Kanazawa published a paper, a peer-reviewed paper, that said it focused on childlessness, high IQ, and childlessness. The central point of the paper is that women with high IQ have a higher incidence of childlessness than the women who are not so smart. That means the population over time will be represented with less and less intelligent people over time. And also, intelligence is highly correlated with general health. So when healthy women, with intelligent, healthy women are going childless, the less intelligent, the less healthy women are multiplying. The less healthy women just make more babies. And so it's like, well, this doesn't work so well, does it? Natural selection that is so-called natural selection, is highly dependent on what the environment decides to select. It could select for stupidity and degraded health. And now this raises some problems. Darwin has basically not been able to prove his point. The complexity, the process of natural selection, is so-called natural selection, will build complexity over time. And in fact, some biologists, evolutionary biologists no less, like Michael Lynch, who happens to be probably the second or third most cited evolutionary biologist on the planet right now, according to H-index. So he's high ranking. He said it's kind of odd to think that quote unquote natural selection is selecting for complexity, because on average, simplicity rather than complexity should be selected. And we're seeing that with the Kanazawa studies. We're also seeing it over the last 10 years in genome sequencing experiments over generations and observations, genome sequencing observations. We're seeing the most reproductively efficient, which have smaller genomes and therefore can make their copies of themselves faster, will often dispose of features and functionality that can be useful in adverse environments. This is known as loss of versatility. So this is like the hiker who has a big backpack and lots of equipment and decides like, well, it's a nice summer day. I don't need all my extra gear and I'll be able to move faster, and dumps all the gear. They are now vulnerable to all sorts of adverse environmental changes. And this is what we are finding in direct observations of DNA. And now evolutionary biologists cannot run away from that. So what is the problem with Darwin's theory? Darwin's theory has been alternatively described by Herbert Spencer in a description that Darwin himself adopted in the 6th edition of his infamous book, Origin of Species. And that is survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest is one way to describe his now failed theory of natural selection. And so one would think, well, that should be so obvious that it would work. And Darwin's dastardly deception, it's dastardly not necessarily just because of him, but because it's been perpetuated, the deception's been perpetuated by evolutionary promoters and propagandists ever since. And they carefully omit the one condition that would make Darwin's theory wrong, and then it is one thing that is now experimentally verified. If the parents are more healthy than their children on average, that is physical fitness, not the stupid evolutionary definition of fitness, but in terms of physical fitness and capability and versatility, if the parents are more healthy and more intelligent on average than all of their children, then survival of the fittest is really survival of the least damage among the offspring. And that's actually optimistic. Survival of the fittest is actually survival of the least damaged. And there is no way under those conditions that Darwinian processes will lead to the outcome that Darwin and evolutionary biologists claim. It'll actually go the opposite direction. This should have been, the warning signs were there in Spiegelman's experiments in the 1960s, where he made an artificial replicating genome that started out as thousands of base pairs of DNA, and the copies of that, RNA, copies of that RNA that got duplicated the fastest were the shorter ones. So as it lost material, as it lost complexity, it reproduced faster, and eventually the genome shrunk to just like a few hundred bases. It went from thousands to a few hundred. And I'm just like, guys, why would you expect anything as complex as a human to evolve by this now falsified mechanism of Darwinian evolution? Because the generation time is on the order of decades rather than like hours, which is the case for bacteria. So Darwin's theory would actually favor reproductive efficiency over complexity, and Michael Lynch came to those terms. Also high ranking is Masatoshi Nei, population geneticist. In graduate school, I had studied his work. We had to use his molecular evolutionary genetics analysis software, something called, I may have gotten the acronym wrong, it's called MEGA. And so he's a geneticist of high rank. He said Darwin never proved his theory. And so this is really disturbing that the evolutionary community and the popular press on one hand will just deny what their senior biologists are saying and then just keep perpetuating the myth, sometimes even in textbooks. This is highly dishonest and not consistent with the highest standards of science. And another evolutionary biologist not too long ago by the name of Brett Weinstein, who's well known, said modern Darwinism is broken. My colleagues are lying to themselves. They are lying to themselves. So just think, all this nonsense of survival of the fittest was accepted as fact. And then now we're realizing, well, okay, if the fittest means the least damage, Darwinism will not work. We hear the sirens going on. Yeah, see, this is sirens. Darwinism means to go on an ambulance and then actually go into hospice care and be just taken away. So why has this been accepted so widely? Well, it's been modeled after how humans advance technology. If we have a blueprint, let's say of a car, some of the early cars, and we have basically, blueprint in the figurative sense of how to construct a car, what we can do is tinker and see, let's try to change this and see if it improves the design. Now, if the design fails, you still have the original blueprint. So you're able to just keep building up progress. So one way to think of this, and so my counterclockwise is your clockwise. So let me see if I get this right. I have to make this counterclockwise. So let's say clockwise is improvement. So from your perspective, this is improvement. Now, in human affairs, we can take the blueprint and make even random changes, and if the random changes don't help, we can dispense of it. So this is like a ratchet mechanism. This is a ratchet wrench. And that means if the random variations are going the wrong way, we can always revert back to the original blueprint and start again. And if we do happen upon an improvement, it ratchets it up in complexity or improvement. And so even if I have random inputs, the ratcheting mechanism will filter out the bad and only accept the good. And so you have inevitable progress in technology. What Darwin did was suppose that this is what happens in nature, that nature will filter out the bad and only accept the good. He said as much in his own words. Natural selection's ever scrutinizing, hourly and daily. It's filtering out the bad and preserving the good. And the problem is, to the extent if it had paralleled the way human technology advances, kind of like this ratchet, it would have worked. The problem is that the blueprints are never preserved. Under the condition, there's nothing that says the parents have to make children with absolutely no variation from the parent. If that were the case, they would at least preserve a good working copy, and then the ratchet mechanism would work. But in the situation where all the children on average have defects that the parents didn't have, even if let's say they improved in one dimension but then failed in 100 others, on average for the children, that is a decline. And then Darwinian processes will then preserve the least damage. But it's actually worse than that, as in the case of when I cited Kanazawa. It'll actually start actively destroying versatility and excess capability to favor reproductive efficiency. Again, this is like a hiker wanting to move faster and having no foresight and dumping all of their equipment and thus losing versatility and capability. This is what we actually see. And there are peer-reviewed papers to this effect, and they're having to recognize this. Somewhere around 10, 15 years ago, even the top evolutionary biologist, according to H-index, which would be Eugene Koonin, his lead author, Uri Wolf, he and his lead author pointed out the dominant mode of evolution is genome reduction. That's if you look at the historical past with their phylogenetic reconstructions. And so the dominant mode is, and he cited, it is this reduction of the genome. He never really explains, he poorly explains it and just glosses it over, the problem of how complexity arose. It would have to happen in like sudden explosions, and he doesn't give a credible mechanism. And so, like a lot of evolutionary publications, they'll finally admit something's wrong and then try to fix it with a speculation that's being passed off as factual, that doesn't actually agree with physics, chemistry, and statistics and probability. It's terrible. But at least I'll grant him, Urey and Kunin and Wolf, credit for admitting half the truth. They admitted half the truth. The dominant mode of natural evolution is loss of complexity, reduction of the genome. What they fail to account for is the emergence of complexity through unknown mechanisms. They pretend they know it, and they actually don't. They don't have an explanation, and I doubt they'll have an explanation based on physics, because I would postulate that a unique event that's probably indistinguishable from a miracle had to be the cause. It is not consistent with the normal modes of physics. Now, Kunin himself has argued, yeah, we know that there's some situations that are so improbable, so we're just going to accept multiple universes, and we just happen to be in the one universe where all those odds are beaten. It's just not natural, but hey, you roll the dice enough, you'll get the outcome you want. And the way to do that is to postulate infinite numbers of universes out there, or large numbers. Now, I need to point out, there's no proof of that. There's no way you can prove it, because these universes are outside of our own reality. You have to appeal to things that are unseen, untestable, unprovable. That doesn't look much different than religion or appealing to a deity, honestly, except Kunin's deity is stupid. The deity of many religions is actually intelligent. So, but all this to say, this is out in peer review. They're having to deal with these problems. And so now we talked about the ratchet. So the ratchet of technology, or clockwise, is improving. The ratchet of technology does tend to lead to improvement. But given that survival of the fittest is the wrong terminology, the more accurate description is survival of the least damage, and that's being optimistic. The result is actually a ratchet in the decline. And this is now so undeniable that Alexei Kondrashov, a colleague of my professor in graduate school, graduate bioinformatics, Kondrashov wrote the book Crumbling Genome, and in it he postulated, he actually had to admit, even if we applied the maximum pressure, like eugenic selection, artificial selection, which is much stronger than natural selection, even if we did that, we could not rescue the crumbling genome. He uses the word crumbling genome. I could say deteriorating. Could not rescue the human crumbling genome. And the only recourse he advocated for was then re-engineering the genome. Now, I worked for a famous genetic engineer in John Sanford. He's my mentor and colleague. And his invention, the gene gun, is in the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. So he understands something about genetic engineering. And he says, plants are one thing. The human genome is way more complex. There'll be all sorts of ethical problems because you can make thousands of experiments that fail with plants, and then you dispose of the failed experiments. That raises ethical issues if you do thousands or millions of experiments with humans and have to dispose of the failed experiments. Not to mention the human genome is so much more complicated. So practically speaking, he doesn't think it's going to work on numerous levels. But even supposing it were able to work, what does that mean? Genomes have to be maintained by intelligence to keep them running, just like repairing a car. But then this raises the issue, if you need intelligence to repair something, didn't you need intelligence to make it in the first place? So brain dead, stupid, unthinking Darwinian processes were not the mechanism by which complexity and capability arose. And that's the real issue. We can be a little bit more rigorous in defining what function and capability and improvement mean. But in general, and I'm working on those projects, in general, it would follow the lines of engineering and medical fitness. So if someone can see, someone can hear, these are analogous to devices that engineers make that have, like a camera can see, a microphone can hear, quote unquote. They're powerful analogies of what capability and function actually are. And it is appalling that evolutionary biologists, even though their top evolutionary biologists like Richard Lewontin pointed out that's the engineering approach is the better way to define fitness, he's been largely ignored because I think if they actually dealt with fitness in terms of the complexity and capability along engineering lines, as Lewontin had advocated, they would see that their theory is a disaster. And that would mean a lot of jobs, reputations, power, and influence. But I think the fundamental reason this is resisted is that the entire industry would have to say the whole foundation of what we have lived for and what we have built upon is a false foundation. It's a lot to say that your friends and yourself and people you loved and respected in the present and throughout history that were promoters and propagandists of evolutionary biologists have been living for a lie. That rather than being heroes of truth and science, you have been villains in the advocacy of false ideas. And that's a hard and painful pill to swallow. And that's in addition to the metaphysical implications. So I fundamentally think that's why there is resistance. But true science is marching forward, and it's painful, this process. But some people are acknowledging the truth, and some are paying for it, like evolutionary biologist Richard Sternberg, who's calling it out. He knew as he studied the matter. He has 2 PhDs, one in evolutionary biology and another in a biology-related discipline. He used his knowledge and he could realize that this is a charade. This is not working. It's unethical to keep perpetuating it. So, am I citing creationist literature in this? I've cited experiments, I've cited observations, and I've cited top-tier evolutionary biologists. And let me just repeat this clip again. If you think that I'm being selective, why doesn't Dr. Dan cite someone of repute who thinks the human genome is improving?
Can you cite anyone that thinks our genome's improving?
No, 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 no.
So there you heard it from the man himself. So with that, we'll close. Maybe on a lighter note, you noticed my ratchet. I'm learning how to repair cars. Ever since I was a little boy, I was always fascinated with tinkering. As a 14-year-old, I was tinkering with the family lawnmower with the Briggs & Stratton engine. And there's one principle that I learned. It's far easier to break than to make. This is why random variation in the complex machines of life, the machines of life are far beyond anything we can engineer, such as the efficient exciton transport that we find in plants. Excitons are quasi-particles that we've only discovered recently, relatively recently, in advanced semiconductor physics. Your LEDs use excitons. So do plants to transport energy. Or quantum magnetic compasses that can detect and control spins of electrons. How's that? How do you like them apples? Or sharks that can sense electric fields better than any instrument we can. I mean, I could just go on and on and on and on. And we know the biophysicists are saying life is more perfect than we imagine. So as an engineer, I like to tinker. But the principle is, if life is more perfect than we imagine, just like in the machines are better optimized than the machines, the comparable analogous machines that humans have made, then definitely it's far easier to break than to make. That's why random variation will lead to damage. At best, you hope it's a neutral change. It will rarely lead to improvement, but if it's already at the limits of what physics will allow, as far as how we would define performance in terms of physical parameters, it's already at the limit. Many biological systems, The only way it's going to change is for the worst. So, give you an example. Let's say your eyes are perfectly in focus, that you don't need glasses. Any variation to the lens of your eye is going to be like going out of focus because it's already at the best stage. And this is a conversation evolutionary biologists are avoiding, and it is a conversation engineers and biophysicists need to hammer on and to clarify the issues, because this does relate to the destiny of the human race. So there's a little bit of kind of my, sharing about my fascination with engineering, and 2/3 of my professional life and academic life were studying engineering and physics and engineering. Now I did mention, see, this is one of the tools. This is from, I modified it with the arrow here that I used to repair a car. But I just got to share on a much lighter, unrelated note. I decided to replace the passenger side CV axle, continuous velocity axle, and I also changed a motor mount recently. I want to make my cars last, and I am fascinated with the process. I got me one of these. This is an impact wrench, impact driver. This one can generate 1,000, almost 1,100 foot-pounds of torque. Now, a human being, even standing on a 1-foot wrench, if he's 200 pounds standing on a 1-foot wrench, he can only generate 200 foot-pounds. This baby can make 1,100 foot-pounds of torque. And the nice thing is it's kind of like a sledgehammer. You don't get twisted around. I mean, you would think that anyone holding this, it would break their wrist as it's torquing, but it doesn't feel like you're holding hardly anything that's turning. And then when I recently changed the motor mount, I got this extension. So how do you like this baby? Huh? This is an extension. I think it's a 19 millimeter on my impact driver. And this thing sounds like a jackhammer. So if you think about it, you're able to deliver a lot of energy, just like when someone's swinging a sledgehammer to crack a rock. Like if you take the sledgehammer and just kind of push on it, it's not going to crack the rock. But you build up all this momentum, and that change of momentum ends up being kind of the cracking force. It's very similar to how an impact wrench works. It's a little bit like a jackhammer. Now that's neither here nor there. But I just had a moment I wanted to share tools. So in sum, the way the ratchet really works, and by the way, this is somewhat related to Muller's ratchet, which he actually works for what they call haploid organisms, but his 1950 paper laid out the foundation, how it's also applicable to diploid organisms. So the ratchet works for haploids, and it's still very bad news for the human race, I'm sorry to say, because the human Y chromosome is subject to Muller's ratchet, but then all the diploid sections of the human genome are subject to a ratchet-like mechanism, which I had articulated as survival of the fittest is actually survival of the least damage. So with that means we're counterclockwise is genetic deterioration. The ratchet is actually going in the wrong direction. It does not work like human technological advancement, where we preserve the blueprints and we can have constant progress. And that is the mistake that evolutionary biologists are reluctant to come to terms with, because if you don't have Darwinian evolution to make all the complexity of life, you have only random variation, and that won't work for the simple reason complex machines are far easier to break than to make. So anyway, thank you for joining me. And in closing, I'll just let Dr. Dan summarize the state of affairs in his own words.
Can you cite anyone that thinks our genome's improving?
Nope. 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 Nope.
Thanks. Time as any, Mr. Newman. Take her down to periscope depth.
Yes, sir. Clear the bridge! Dive!